We had a balance patch for Marvel Snap on Tuesday that looks to have finally dethroned Shuri from the number 1/2 spot that she's enjoyed in Marvel Snap for many months now. While it's definitely too early to say what will decidedly be the best decks in this format, there's definitely some early front runners that we're going to go over today. We're going to talk about ways to possibly attack these decks, deck lists that look like they're good at executing those counter strategies. Let's go ahead and jump right into it, starting by talking about the first of the three frontrunner decks of the current early format. One of the most popular decks on the Marvel Snap ladder right now, and definitely one of the decks you need to have a game plan for beating if you're looking to ladder up, is the Sandman powered Electro Ramp. So Sandman, really powerful prison-esque card, ongoing effect. Players can only play one card per turn. This archetype's been around the fringes of the format, but it had a pretty bad Shuri matchup, not able to keep up with the big numbers that deck was putting out, meaning that when Shuri was brought down in the most recent balance patch, this deck was a natural contender vying to fill the void for best deck in the format. You'll see this deck's got a ton of cards that are really expensive, and on the back of the deck's namesake here, Electro, we can play those cards sooner than planned. One of your ideal draws with this deck are typically an Electro on turn 3 into a Sandman, restricting your opponent's plays just like your own are restricted on turn 4, and then our turns 5 and 6 could be other powerful plays like Doctor Doom into Odin, or even the freshly buffed Leader, which can copy our opponent's only play for the turn. Vying for the number 1 slot with Electro Ramp is definitely the Dino Hawk deck, in my opinion. This deck has kind of become the go-to make big numbers deck in the wake of Shuri getting knocked down a peg, while Devil, Dinosaur, as well as Darkhawk aren't quite as large as something like a Shuried Red Skull. They're typically large enough to get the job done, being able to dominate a path entirely on their own. The thing that kind of ties these two ongoing cards together in this deck is definitely Mystique, who can on reveal copy the effects of either of these large beaters. A very typical play pattern you're going to execute in this deck is you'll play Devil, Dinosaur, or Darkhawk on turn 5, and then on turn 6 you'll deploy the Mystique to copy their effect, and then if you are copying a Devil Dinosaur, you can follow it up with Agent Coulson to generate extra cards in your hand, making both Mystique and Dino bigger. Or if you're copying a Darkhawk, Zabu's cost reduction can allow you to follow that up with a Rock Slide, again making these things larger in a way that your opponent typically is not going to be prepared for. The other thing that this archetype has going for it that makes it a force to be reckoned with is that you get to play some key interactive cards. Cosmo kind of does double duty, protecting our large stat sticks from opposing interaction like Shang-Chi or Enchantress, but Cosmo also is a disruptive card, being able to shut down opposing Galactuses that are looking to blow up the board. Finally, speaking of Shang-Chi's, this is another 4 energy play that works well with our Zabu and can chop our opponent's large things down to side for when our things aren't quite big enough to get the job done on their own. Coming in as number 3 in the top decks to be watching, in my opinion, is definitely the Galactus archetype. There's a number of variations of this deck. Some of them are playing Shuri and Nimrod, for example. Others are more Electro Wave focused, like this one, but they all feel a kind of similar core in that they're trying to enable this incredibly powerful and polarizing card. While this deck has a little bit worse metrics on the untapped tracker stats than the first 2 deck lists that we looked at today, this deck list also is incredibly popular, and even if you don't plan to play it yourself, it's definitely a deck that you need to have a cohesive game plan against, or you're going to be retreating a significant amount of matches as your opponents try to blow up 2/3 of the board again and again and again. Now, if you're not interested in any of the big 3 decks I just listed as being front runners for this developing metagame, I think there are a number of counter picks that are competitive and reasonable into these 3, starting with this Patriot variation here that I think ticks a lot of the boxes that you're looking to check in this format. Patriot, for those not familiar, powerful ongoing card, gives all of your cards with no abilities +2 power. This deck has a number of cheap cards that help you flood the board early, such as Shocker, Misty Knight, Squirrel Girl, and even Wasp that let us get down stats into play ahead of something like Sandman in the Electro Ramp deck, while also having some powerful top end plays that mean if that deck's namesake gets into play, we're still fairly happy only playing one card per turn. Dr. Doom fans out stats across the board, with the Doombots having no abilities, meaning they get boosted by Patriot, and Ultron providing a similar effect, giving us a larger stat line where we play it out while fanning out its drones across the board, which are all abilityless and getting powered up by Patriot as well. This deck also has reasonable tools for checking the Galactus deck, whether it's debris, kicking up rocks, meaning they have multiple cards at their location and Galactus can't trigger. These rocks are also 1 energy cards that are abilityless, so they get pumped by Khazar and Patriot, or if it's Storm, flooding out the only location that our opponent hasn't deployed things to yet, meaning that Galactus is no longer a safe play to there. I think this deck does a good job of standing up to both the Electro decks in the format, while also pumping out large enough numbers to keep up with what the Dino Darkhawk decks are doing with some consistency. My second counter pick recommendation into the current format is this Thanos Control deck. I think the primary feature about this deck that is wonderful is if you're someone like me who absolutely despises losing to Galactus, this deck absolutely shoves that polarizing pile of cards into a trash can, whether it's Viper donating something across the board, or Green Goblin hopping across itself, or a Polaris dragging one of their 1 or 2 energy plays into their Galactus path. We have a ton of ways of stopping their big bad from triggering. Even if we don't have one of these 3 disruptive cards, we can just let the Galactus blow the game board up while we Spider-Man them out of being able to play things on their following turn, or we can simply deploy Professor X where we know they're going to be Galactusing, locking the only location that's left in the game completely down. This deck also does a good job of playing to the board early thanks to the Infinity Stones that Thanos provides, meaning that we often have enough stats into play before Sandman can flip up, really slowing the game down. My third counter pick recommendation for this developing metagame is good old-fashioned Sera Surfer. I think this deck has excellent tools to play into both Galactus as well as the Darkhawk Devil Dinosaur deck. We've got Cosmo, Juggernaut, Polaris, Storm, Goose as all fantastically disruptive ways to make sure Galactus is not able to blow up the board. And we've got Rogue here as a really fantastically powerful counterplay to things like Null, as well as Darkhawk and Devil Dinosaur. This deck also does a good job on the back of its namesake, simply putting a lot of numbers into play when that's the best thing for you to be doing. And Killmonger, played in tandem with Nova, gives us a secondary way to pump up everything that we have in play. I do think that this archetype struggles a little bit in the Sandman matchup, but the most notable thing to watch for when you know you're playing there is you basically never want to play Sera on 5 in the Sandman matchup, because it's frequent that Sandman's going to be coming out by that turn. So you just want to get as many 3s into play as possible, not counting on that big flourish for the final moments of the game. To round out my recommendations of specific deck lists that could be reasonable into the current format, I wanted to throw on here an oldie but a goodie in Spectrum Destroyer. Spectrum Destroyer is a deck that was powerful on and off over many of Marvel Snap's early formats before Shuri really got a stranglehold on the format, where this deck just wasn't quite able to generate big enough numbers to keep up with that deck consistently. That being said, this deck still gets to play a ton of incredibly powerful and disruptive elements in the form of Cosmo, Armor, and Professor X that all serve double duty of enabling our deck's namesake here in the Destroyer, making it so this 15 power 6 energy card doesn't harm our own board. This deck also gets to play an ongoing sub-theme, meaning in the games where Destroyer as a single stat stick in one path is not going to be good enough, we also get to leverage Spectrum at the top end of the curve, able to play out 5 points wherever she is at, while also simultaneously pumping all of our various ongoing cards that we are playing as well. In addition to giving some specific deck lists like we already covered in this video, I also like to call out some individual cards that can be good things to kind of build or brew around that help you attack the popular decks in the format in convenient ways. And these are kind of 8 cards that you probably don't want to put all in the same deck list, but I think in the right combination with other things can be good tools to allow you to be competitive in the format. Iceman, I think, is subtly one of the better cards you can be playing in the Electro matchup in particular. Iceman notably can't hit a 6-cost card, meaning if you play this card on the first or second turn of the game against the Electro deck, you have a high probability of hitting either their Electro, Wave, or Sandman, which is ultimately going to slow their game plan down a pretty significant amount. Goose is a card that restricts the way your opponent's able to play out in addition to yourself, but if you build your deck in a way where you play mostly low-cost cards, Goose can become a kind of one-sided prison effect that is excellent at only dictating where the Electro deck is able to play out at, but also where the Galactus deck is going to be able to deploy their key cards to. Goose can even potentially be powerful if you play it out into the Galactus path the turn that they're blowing up the board, because Goose will prevent them from playing their big follow-up like a copy of Null that would, generally speaking, be locking up the game for them. I think potentially the two biggest winners in terms of power level increases from the previous format to the current one in Marvel Snap are likely Rogue as well as Super Skrull. These two cards were very terrible in the previous format where Shuri was the top dog, basically having no text, or in the case of Super Skrull having text that was actively detrimental. However, in a world where Galactus is putting Null into play and Dark Hawk and Devil Dinosaur are the premier big things that your opponents are generating numbers with, Rogue as well as Super Skrull are cards that are extremely well positioned to give you big numbers while putting your opponent at a decent disadvantage. Debris has synergy with a few things in Marvel Snap, such as the Patriot that we talked about earlier. She also works well with things such as Viper, letting you donate one of your rocks across the other side of the board to clutter your opponent's space even further. And most importantly, in this current format, she's a very proactive means of putting cards into all 3 of your opponent's lanes, making Galactus a very difficult card for them to deploy. Speaking of Sandman and Doctor Doom, I think Doctor Doom's actually one of the better cards you could be playing in other decks in this format as well. The Sandman deck typically gets just a very little bit ahead or even slightly behind by the time they deploy their namesake to the board, and they're typically counting on their own Doctor Doom to be able to pull them ahead by playing to all 3 locations simultaneously. This gives you a lot of opportunities to play your own Doom bots out, meaning that you maintain even a small lead over them if you're matching them play for play. Similarly, Claw, while not quite as powerful as Doctor Doom, plays to 2 lanes simultaneously, which is still quite good in the Sandman matchup, where they're generally speaking only expecting you to be able to play to a single location each turn once they've limited your plays to 1 per turn. What have you found you've had the most success with in this developing metagame so far? I'd love to hear about it in the comments down below. If you enjoyed my musing on the topic, as always, snap that like button, and hopefully we'll see you back again here real soon for some more Marvel Snap content here on YouTube.